What do you picture when you hear the words Roman Emperor? A majestic figure in a purple toga with a laurel wreath on his forehead, sitting on an ivory throne. A man whose word is law for tens of millions of people, from misty Britain to sultry Egypt. We imagine limitless power, unimaginable luxury, endless feasts and orgies, where wine pours in rivers and desires are fulfilled at the snap of a finger. The image of a demigod, the Lord of the world. But it is only a shining mask, created by propaganda and polished over centuries. If we look behind it, we see not a god, but a man locked in the most luxurious and dangerous prison in history. The emperor's life was not a holiday, but a life sentence of responsibility, loneliness, and paranoia. Every day was a balancing act on a knife blade, where a wrong step, a careless word, or a too trusting glance could lead to an agonizing death at the hands of those who had sworn loyalty just yesterday. Their world was a palace whose walls were soaked with poison and betrayal. Their family was a tangle of snakes where wife, son, or brother could be their worst enemies. Their food was tasted for poison. Their sleep was guarded by bodyguards who could be assassins themselves. Every smiling senator was a potential conspirator. Every loyal general a future usurper. Behind this eternal struggle for survival, there was also a deeply personal drama. The ruler of the world was the loneliest man in it. Who could he trust? With whom could he share his fears without fear that his weakness would be used against him? Therefore, emperors often sought solace in the arms of favorites. Men or women whose devotion seemed sincere. These relationships, such as the famous union of the Emperor Hadrian and the young man Antinous, became for them the only island of human warmth in the icy ocean of power. But even this closeness was a dangerous game, causing jealousy and intrigue at court. Would you like to have such power? Would you be willing to pay a price measured not in gold, but in eternal fear, total loneliness, and the possibility of being slaughtered in your own bed? Could you live a day, a week, a year knowing that every person around you, from senator to slave, might want you dead? Stay tuned to the end, and you'll learn what an emperor's workday really consisted of. Why the Praetorian Guard was scarier than enemy legions. How a ruler ran an empire without a telephone or internet. And why family was the main threat to his life. And how in this world of absolute power and paranoia, the emperor struggled to find love, friendship, and meaning. This is not a story about gods. It's a story about people on top of a world that turned out to be the edge of an abyss. Contrary to the myth of eternal idleness, the Roman emperor's day was timed to the minute and filled with tedious, monotonous work. He was not just a ruler, but the supreme official, chief magistrate, and supreme administrator of a gigantic bureaucratic machine. His working day began at dawn and often ended late at night. The emperor's morning began with the so-called salutation, the morning reception. Dozens or even hundreds of senators, horsemen, officials, and petitioners lined up to greet the ruler, express their loyalty, and, if they were lucky, resolve some personal issue. It was not just a formal ritual, but an important political tool. The emperor had to remember names, know about family ties, and give signs of attention, showing his awareness and favor. It required tremendous memory and concentration. After the morning reception, the main work began. The emperor sat for hours in his office, sorting through mountains of correspondence from all over the empire. Letters from provincial governors, military reports from the frontiers, financial reports, complaints from urban communities. All of it flowed to him. He had to go into the details of building an aqueduct somewhere in Gaul, deal with a tax dispute in Asia, and decide on the transfer of legions on the Danube. Every document required his resolution. A great deal of time was occupied by court sessions. The emperor was the highest court of justice. He personally presided over the most important trials, listening to the parties, questioning witnesses, and passing the final judgment. The lives and fates of people depended on his decision. It was a tremendous moral and intellectual burden. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, known for his love of philosophy, complained in his diaries about how this judicial routine exhausted him and distracted him from thinking about the eternal. Even lunch and dinner were rarely times for rest. They were often working meetings with advisors, receptions of foreign ambassadors, or political banquets where intrigue and negotiations continued around the table. The emperor had virtually no personal time. He belonged not to himself, but to the state. This endless routine was exhausting. It required iron health, a sharp mind, and incredible self-discipline. Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, Trajan, all the good emperors were in fact workaholics who dragged on themselves a gigantic load of state affairs. Their lives were not about enjoying power, but serving it. And this grueling labor was, paradoxically, the safest time of day. The real danger awaited the emperor not in the piles of scrolls, but in the silence of the palace corridors, in the flattery of the courtiers, and in the glint of the daggers of his own bodyguards. No man in Rome lived in such fear for his life as the emperor. His power was absolute, but it was not guaranteed. It rested on a delicate balance of loyalty from the army, the Senate, and the people. And there were always those who wanted to upset this balance. Conspiracies were commonplace. Of the 70 or so emperors who ruled Rome, more than 30 were assassinated. To become emperor was to have a target painted on your back. The main source of danger was those who were supposed to protect, the Praetorian Guard. These elite soldiers stationed in Rome were the emperor's personal guards, but they were also the main creators of coups. It was the Praetorians who killed Caligula and put his uncle Claudius on the throne. They killed Galba, auctioned off the Imperial throne after the murder of Pertinax. The emperor paid them huge salaries and gave them gifts, but he could never be sure of their loyalty. He was their hostage. Every day, seeing these tall, heavily armed guardsmen around him, he had to wonder if this day would be his last. Paranoia was becoming second nature. The emperor trusted no one. His food and drink were tasted by special tasters to make sure they weren't poisoned. His bedroom was closely guarded. Some, like Tiberius, fled Rome altogether, ruling the empire from a fortified villa on the island of Capri. Others, like Domitian, are rumored to have lined the walls of their chambers with polished stone so that they could see those approaching from behind in the reflection. Every gesture, every word was analyzed for hidden threats. A general too popular? He should be recalled and executed. A senator too rich and powerful? He should be charged with conspiracy and his property confiscated. A network of spies and informers swept Rome. The atmosphere at court was saturated with fear and suspicion. This life of constant tension was maddening. Emperors became suspicious, cruel, tyrannical. Caligula, Nero, Commodus, Caracalla. Their madness was largely the result of this unbearable pressure. When you can't trust anyone, not even your own family, the only way to ensure your safety seems to be preventive terror. In this world of total distrust, the only outlet was relationships beyond politics. The emperor could find a friend or lover among people of low birth, freedmen, or even slaves, whose loyalty seemed to him more sincere than the flattery of senators. But it was also dangerous, as such favorites quickly gained enormous influence, causing hatred among the Roman elite and becoming a target for new intrigues. The life of the emperor was an eternal game of Russian roulette, and even if he managed to avoid the dagger of the conspirator, he could not evade another, no less heavy burden, the burden of power. The emperor was not only the ruler, but also the final instance of justice. Any citizen of Rome, and eventually any citizen of the empire, could appeal to the emperor's court if they felt they had been treated unfairly. This made the ruler the supreme judge for tens of millions of people. Imagine this responsibility. Two people stand before you. One accuses the other of theft, murder, betrayal. You listen to lawyers, witnesses, examine the evidence, and your decision is final. You can send the man to execution, banish him to penal servitude, deprive him of all his property, or acquit him. The price of a mistake is a human life. Many emperors took this duty extremely seriously. Claudius, despite his reputation as a crank, spent entire days in court, scrutinizing the most intricate cases. Marcus Aurelius regarded justice as his chief philosophical duty. They realized that justice was one of the pillars on which their power and stability in the empire rested. But this power was also a terrible temptation. For an emperor with tyrannical tendencies, the court became an instrument of reprisal against the unwanted. Charges of insult to majesty could be brought against anyone who looked askance at the emperor's statue or made a careless joke. Trials under rulers like Tiberius or Nero turned into a farce where the verdict was known in advance. This role of supreme judge isolated the emperor from ordinary human emotions. He had to be impartial, detached. He saw the darkest sides of human nature: greed, lies, betrayal, cruelty. This could not but leave an imprint on his personality. He became accustomed to the fact that his word decides destinies. The constant need to judge others led to the fact that the emperor himself felt himself a defendant, before the gods, before history, before his conscience. This burden was unbearably heavy. It is easy to be just in one case, but how can you keep your mind clear and your heart pure when thousands of cases pass through your hands, and each of them is someone's broken life? The emperor was hostage to his judicial power. He could not give it up, because that would be perceived as weakness, but it was also painful to carry it. And this agony was only part of the gigantic administrative machine which he had to manage alone. Running the Roman Empire was like being the CEO of a giant corporation spanning 3 continents, only without the telephone, email, internet, or airplanes. All communication was done by couriers who took weeks or even months to reach remote provinces. The emperor had to keep an enormous amount of information in his head: the state of the treasury, the collection of taxes, grain prices, road construction, the state of the legions on the borders. All this demanded his attention. He was the center of a gigantic web where all the threads of governance were woven together. His main tools were letters and decrees. Every day he dictated or wrote dozens of letters to viceroys, commanders, and city magistrates. The correspondence between Emperor Trajan and Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, which has come down to us, illustrates this process perfectly. Pliny asked the emperor for advice on a variety of issues: how to build a bathhouse, what to do with anonymous denunciations of Christians, how to organize a fire department, and to each letter Trajan gives a balanced, detailed answer. The emperor had to respond to crises: a crop failure in Egypt, grain shipments to Rome must be urgently organized to prevent famine and riots, a revolt in Judea, we must send the best legions and the most experienced commander, an earthquake in Asia Minor, we must allocate funds to rebuild the cities. To cope with this flow of affairs, the emperor relied on his apparatus, a chancellery composed of educated slaves and freedmen, and later of members of the horsemen's class. But the final decision always rested with him. This job required not only intelligence, but also systematic thinking. The emperor had to understand how his decision made today in Rome would reverberate 6 months later on the border with Parthia. He had to balance the interests of different provinces, different sectors of the population, the army, and the Senate. It was a titanic work, invisible to most. The people saw the emperor at the games in the Colosseum or during triumphal processions, but they did not see him bent over maps and scrolls by the light of an oil lamp, trying alone to keep the vast, complex world in balance. The power of the emperor was not only a privilege but also hard labor, and to justify this power in the eyes of millions, he had to constantly work on his image, turning his life into an endless performance. The Roman emperor was not just a politician, he was a brand. His image, his reputation, his history were the most important tools for managing the empire. He had to constantly prove his right to power, and for this purpose, the whole arsenal of ancient PR technologies was used. The main media of the time were coins. On one side was minted the profile of the ruling emperor, and on the other, a symbolic image glorifying his deeds. Victory in war was depicted as the goddess Victoria, generosity in the form of giving money to the people, stability in the form of the goddess with a horn of plenty. Millions of such coins were distributed throughout the empire, bringing the image and ideology of the ruler to the most remote corners. Every time the inhabitants of the empire took a denarius in their hands, they saw the face of their lord. Statues and busts of the emperor were erected everywhere. They stood in forums, in temples, in basilicas, and the image was carefully thought out. Augustus was depicted as an eternally young, energetic ruler, even when he was already an old man. Marcus Aurelius, as a bearded philosopher, immersed in thoughts about the good of the state. These statues created the effect of the omnipresence of power. Grandiose building projects were also part of propaganda. The Colosseum built by the Flavians was not just an arena for games, but a symbol of their victory and generosity to the people. The Pantheon, rebuilt by Hadrian, was a symbol of the unity of all the gods and therefore of all the peoples of the empire under the rule of Rome. Each new forum, aqueduct, or bridge bore the emperor's name and glorified him as a caring builder and benefactor. Of course, the most important element of propaganda was bread and spectacles. The emperor organized grandiose gladiatorial fights, chariot races, and food distributions. Appearing in the Colosseum box, he demonstrated his unity with the people, his generosity, and his power. The reaction of the crowd was a barometer of his popularity. The emperor was the main actor on the Roman political stage. His life was a public spectacle. His every exit, every word, every gesture was thought out and mattered. He could not afford to be a mere man. He always had to play a role, the role of the father of the fatherland, the high priest, the invincible general. This need to be constantly on display, constantly conforming to the perfect image, was incredibly tiring. The emperor had no private life. He was always at work. And when he returned from this public stage to his luxurious chambers, he entered another prison, a prison of gold and marble. The emperor's palace on the Palatine Hill was a symbol of his power and wealth. Marble halls, gilded ceilings, mosaic floors, fountains, gardens with outlandish plants. All these were meant to amaze the imagination and demonstrate the greatness of Rome. Luxury was not just a whim, but a political necessity. The imperial feast became legendary. Flamingo tongues, peacock brains, rare fish livers, and other exotic delicacies brought from all over the empire were served. Wine flowed from golden goblets. The guests were entertained by musicians, dancers, and poets. But behind this dazzling luxury, there was an emptiness. The palace was not a house, but a labyrinth full of intrigue, flattery, and hidden enmity. Every courtier had his own agenda. Each tried to get closer to the emperor to gain position, wealth, or influence. Sincerity was a rare commodity. The emperor was surrounded by a crowd, but he was absolutely alone. He could not have real friends because any friendship immediately became a political factor. He could not just have a heart-to-heart talk because any word he said could be interpreted as an order or used against him. Palace etiquette was strict and stifling. Every step, every gesture was regulated. Who to talk to, how to sit, what to eat, everything was subject to protocol. This formality created a distance between the emperor and the rest of the people, turning him into a living statue. In this atmosphere of total loneliness, the emperor sought any source of human warmth. He might have attached himself to his horse, like Caligula, or to his pets. He could find solace in philosophy, like Marcus Aurelius, or in art, like Nero, but more often than not, he sought intimacy in relationships that were free of political calculation. It could have been relationships with freedmen who had served him since childhood, or with favorites whose loyalty seemed genuine. Emperor Hadrian found such an outlet in his love for Antinius. He took him with him on all his trips around the empire, showered him with favors, and after his tragic death, deified him and founded a city in his honor. This grief was not a political gesture, but the cry of the soul of the loneliest man in the world. The palace was a golden cage for the emperor. It gave him everything except the most important thing, the freedom to be himself and trust people. And the most dangerous part of this cage was his own family. If outsiders were a threat to the emperor, his own family was a source of mortal danger. The history of Roman imperial dynasties is a bloody drama full of conspiracies, murders, and betrayals, where the closest people became bitter enemies. The emperor's wife, Augusta, was not just a spouse, but an important political figure. She wielded great influence, weaved intrigue, promoted her supporters, and often tried to secure the throne for her son, even if he was not the son of the ruling emperor. Livia, the wife of Augustus, was suspected of eliminating all other potential heirs so that the throne would go to her son Tiberius. Agrippina the Younger was rumored to have poisoned her husband, Emperor Claudius, so that her son from a previous marriage, Nero, could take power. Sons and heirs were an even bigger headache. The emperor had to prepare a successor, but this successor, having grown up, often grew weary of waiting and became the center of a conspiracy. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, was the exact opposite of his philosopher father and brought the empire to crisis. Caracalla murdered his own brother Geta in order to rule alone. Brothers, nephews, uncles. Any male relative with a drop of imperial blood in his veins was a potential usurper. Therefore, many emperors systematically eliminated their relatives to secure their throne. It was a cruel necessity dictated by the logic of survival. The problem of succession to the throne was the Achilles heel of the entire imperial system. In Rome, there was no clear law on the transfer of power. The throne could be inherited, it could be seized by force, and it could be given to an adopted successor. This uncertainty created a constant struggle for power within the imperial house. The family was not a safe haven for the emperor, but a battlefield. He could not trust his wife, feared his son, suspected his brother. In this atmosphere, the only way to protect himself was to keep everyone in fear and at a distance. And that made his loneliness even worse. He was the head of state, but he could not be the head of a normal family. And on top of that, he had another very special role to play, that of mediator between the people and the gods. The Roman emperor was not only a secular leader, but also a spiritual leader. He held the title of Supreme Pontiff, that is, the High Priest of Rome. He was responsible for maintaining divine peace, the proper relationship between the state and the gods. He presided over the most important religious ceremonies, consecrated temples, and made sure that rituals were observed. But his religious role was not limited to this. From the very beginning of Augustus' reign, an imperial cult began to take shape. The veneration of the emperor and his family as the divine protectors of Rome. At first, only dead emperors were deified, whom the Senate by a special decision ranked among the gods. Thus, Julius Caesar became Divine Julius, and Augustus became Divine Augustus. In their honor, temples were built and sacrifices were made. Over time, however, the line between man and God began to blur. Some emperors, like Caligula or Domitian, demanded divine honors while they were still alive. They proclaimed themselves living gods, demanded to be worshipped, and placed their statues in temples next to those of Jupiter. For most people in the empire, especially in the Greek East, where the tradition of deifying rulers was strong, this was normal. But for the Roman nobility, it was a shock and a manifestation of unprecedented tyranny. Imagine the psychological state of a person who is officially honored as a god. On the one hand, it flatters vanity and strengthens power. On the other hand, it creates tremendous pressure. You have to live up to this image, be infallible, wise, omnipotent. But at the same time, you remain a mere mortal. You get sick, you grow old, you experience fear and doubt. This created a deep inner conflict. How do you reconcile the knowledge of your own human nature with the need to play the role of a god on earth? Some, like Vespasian, treated it with humor. As he was dying, he is said to have joked, "Alas, I seem to be becoming a god." Others seem to have begun to believe in their own divinity, with disastrous consequences for themselves and the state. This duality, man and God in one person, was another factor that isolated the emperor from the rest of the world. He could not be just a man among men. His status placed him above everyone else. But this elevation was a form of exile from human society. And in this divine loneliness, he desperately sought simple human affection. In a world where everyone sought his favor for profit and family was a source of threats, the emperor was desperate for sincere affection. He looked for people with whom he could be himself without fear of betrayal, and he often found them not among the nobility, but among those who meant nothing in the political hierarchy. Many emperors surrounded themselves with favorites, confidants who became their closest friends, advisors, and sometimes lovers. These relationships were complex and multifaceted. It was not just friendship, but a deep emotional dependence. The favorite was the only person to whom the emperor could pour out his soul, share his fears and doubts. Sometimes it was talented freedmen, former slaves, who ran the imperial chancery and wielded enormous power behind the scenes. Under Emperor Claudius, freedmen such as Narcissus and Palantus actually ran the empire. Sometimes they were young, handsome young men whose love and devotion seemed to the emperor the only true thing in his life. The most famous example is the already mentioned relationship between Emperor Hadrian and the Greek youth Antinous. For Hadrian, Antinous was not just a lover, but a kindred spirit, a companion in his travels and intellectual pursuits. His death was a terrible blow to the emperor, and he tried to perpetuate his memory by building temples and cities in his honor. It was an attempt to conquer death and loneliness with the help of power. Such relationships, however, were a two-edged sword. They gave the emperor emotional support, but provoked the fury and jealousy of senators and courtiers. The noble Romans considered it humiliating that some upstart, whether a former slave or a foreign youth, had more influence over the emperor than they did. Favorites were hated, intrigued against, and often killed immediately after the death of their patron. For the emperor himself, such an attachment was also a risk. He became vulnerable. His feelings could be used to manipulate him. And yet many emperors took this risk because the need for human intimacy was stronger than fear. The emperor's personal life was as much a part of the political field as anything else. His friendship, his love, his affections, all these were immediately made public and a factor in the struggle for power. And no favorite, no love could save him from the main and last enemy that equalizes everyone, slaves and emperors alike. Even if the emperor managed to survive the conspiracies, wars, and burdens of power, the last and inevitable enemy awaited him: time. He was a living god, but his body aged and ached like any mortal's. And for an absolute ruler, physical infirmity was not just a personal problem, but a national catastrophe. As soon as it was known that the emperor was ill or weakening, a power struggle began immediately at court. Potential heirs began to gather troops, senators, to form factions. The entire empire froze in anticipation. The emperor's illness signaled the beginning of a political crisis. The emperor himself was in a terrible position. He felt his strength draining away, but he had to show vigor and clarity of mind so as not to provoke a coup. He was surrounded by doctors, but could he trust them? Any medicine could have turned out to be poison. Any procedure could be murder in disguise. The aging emperor saw those who had fawned before him yesterday begin to look ingratiatingly in the direction of his heir. He saw that to the world he was almost non-existent. Everyone was waiting for only one thing: his last breath. This was the last and most terrible humiliation for the Lord of the world. Some met death with dignity and courage. Augustus, dying, asked his friends if he had played the comedy of life well. Vespasian made jokes, but many died in fear and loneliness, abandoned by all. An emperor's death was rarely peaceful. He could be poisoned, smothered with a pillow, stabbed in his bathtub, and immediately after his death, the battle over his legacy began. The Senate decided whether he was worthy of deification or whether his memory should be cursed. In the latter case, all his statues were destroyed, his name was erased from inscriptions, and all his decrees were canceled. Yesterday's God became today's nothing. The emperor's journey is a journey from absolute power to absolute powerlessness in the face of death. His whole life was a preparation for this last moment, when all the luxury, all the power, and all the legions of the world could not add a single extra heartbeat to his life. Being a Roman emperor meant not enjoying power, but serving it to the last breath. It was not a life, but a role to be played 24 hours a day, without margin for error, weakness, or sincerity. The purple toga was not a symbol of luxury, but a heavy shroud that the ruler wore on the day he ascended the throne. We saw that behind the facade of divine grandeur lay the grueling labor of officialdom, the constant fear of assassination, the unbearable burden of judicial decisions, and the colossal administrative work. The palace was not a home, but a golden cage full of loneliness, and the family was not a support, but a nest of traitors. The emperor was a slave to his status, an actor on an endless stage, and the loneliest man in the empire he had created. His life is a tragic story of how absolute power corrupts, isolates, and ultimately destroys man. It shows that even at the top of the world, man remains human, with his fears, his needs for love and intimacy, and his mortal nature. And the higher he climbed, the more painful it was to fall. The history of the Roman emperors is not just a series of names and dates. It is an eternal reminder of the price of power and the fact that the strongest prison is the one a man builds for himself out of gold, marble, and fear. If you were interested in getting a peek behind the scenes of the greatest power in history, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, whose other life in ancient Rome would you like to examine under a microscope? Perhaps the life of gladiators, the secrets of Vestaloki, or the daily routine of a Roman matron? After all, the most interesting stories are often hidden not in battles, but in the details of human destinies.